Hey, welcome back to the channel and to our problematic Bible verses series. Before we get started, I just want to take a second and say thank you for taking the time to join us through the journey of the last 5 episodes. Now, if this is the first episode that you're actually catching, I would strongly suggest that you pause it for a minute, go back, kind of catch up on the last 5 episodes that we did do, and that way you can kind of get a feel and an idea for kind of the flow and how we've handled some of the issues that have come up and some of the texts that we've discussed. Now, over the course of this series, we've tackled some of the most difficult and challenging sections or portions of the Bible, passages that people constantly label as very problematic. And these are the verses that skeptics usually use to make the claim that God is immoral, that he's unjust, that he's contradictory, and that he can't be trusted. And one of the things that we've tried to do throughout the series is to slow everything down and ask a very important question. Are we reacting to what the text actually says, or are we reacting to assumptions that have been made and that have been brought into the text? Because over and over again, as we've looked at each individual passage, we've discovered that context matters a lot. Language matters, history matters, cultures matter, and many times the verses that people and skeptics actually use to try to discredit the Bible become a lot more complicated once you actually buckle down and start investigating them. And that's because so far, as we've discovered in the last 5 episodes, a lot of the foundations that these claims are built on are compromised, to say the very least. And once you start bringing in questioning or scrutiny, or even any kind of intellectual thought, those foundations get washed away pretty quickly, and the claim falls flat on its face. But tonight's episode is actually a little bit different than a lot of the verses that we've previously discussed, because I genuinely feel that this is possibly one of the most darkest, most emotionally difficult, and probably most debated stories that we've touched on so far. It's not just a verse that sounds kind of weird or strange. This is a story that makes people deeply uncomfortable and deeply emotional. It's a story that's actually caused a lot of people, both skeptics and Christians alike, to pause, to stop and ask the question, what exactly is happening in this text? Because tonight we're going to step into something. We're going to step into a passage that has led many people to accuse the Bible of something completely horrific. And that is not just being okay with, but endorsing and approving human sacrifice. Now, before we go any further, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. This is not going to be one of those episodes where we pretend like there's no tension, or we're just going to kind of give shallow answers because we're afraid to actually deal with the text. And we're also not going to treat this verse casually like it's just some random section of scripture that doesn't really matter. Because personally, I don't think that scripture itself takes this portion of scripture casually. It's one of those moments in the Bible that feels extremely heavy. And if what we're about to go over bothers you emotionally, it probably should. And I actually think that's pretty understandable. But at the same time, I think there's a real danger of rushing into a passage and then rushing out of it and not quite taking the time to fully understand everything that it means and everything that it's trying to convey, because it does get pretty uncomfortable. And then ultimately we end up missing the larger story surrounding it. See, the first point that we are going to make is that there's a very big, very stark difference between the Bible describing something and the Bible prescribing something. And what that means is there's a very big difference between the Bible advocating for an action or approving of something, and the Bible just honestly recording events as they happened, even when those events are tragic, disturbing, or deeply uncomfortable. And what we find is sometimes that's exactly what Scripture does. It gives us the full story, all the good, all the bad, and all the ugly. Sometimes the Bible tells the truth about human depravity and human brokenness without softening the details at all. It chooses to give us the story in full, even when it gets messy. Because the argument that we're about to make for the portion of scripture that we're about to read is that a lot of the time, the point of the biblical narrative is not to celebrate inaction or celebrate events that are happening, but to expose how spiritually corrupt and compromised people can become when they choose to abandon the truth in pursuit of their own. And honestly, we understand this concept pretty naturally in just about any storytelling that we find, modern or ancient. Think about something like Star Wars. Now, if you haven't seen the movie yet, it came out in 1977. So my first question would be, why have you not seen that movie yet? But my point is that you can watch any single one of those films because the original series had 3 films. It was a trilogy, and you can follow the immediate plot unfolding in front of you. Each movie can serve as its kind of own individual story, but there's also a deeper story that's happening underneath of the movie or the story that's being told. There's a larger narrative or a larger backstory that shapes the characters, their decisions, their fears, their motives, and ultimately why the events around them are happening. And the same thing is true when we read the Bible. There's often a story behind the story, a larger spiritual context shaping why people act the way they do and why certain events unfold the way that they do. And that deeper context is absolutely critical if we want to understand what's really happening in the story that we're about to read. Because the question that we're asking in this episode is not just, did these events actually happen? But the deeper question that we're going to ask is, what is the Bible trying to show us in this story? What is the point of the story? So tonight we're going to slow down. We're going to examine one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible. And that story is about Jephthah and his daughter in the book of Judges. So what we're going to do first is actually read the passage in question that's the subject of tonight's video. And the reason we're going to read it is because it's important to not only understand what we're reading, but to understand and hear the backdrop of the story itself, and to get a firsthand experience with the text. Now, once we're done reading it, we'll start slowing things down. We'll start kind of combing through it and just kind of evaluating it and figuring it out and breaking it down. So the story we're looking at tonight is found in Judges chapter 11. If we start at verse 1, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead, his mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. "You are not going to get any inheritance in our family," they said, "because you are the son of another woman." So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. Sometime later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. "Come," they said, "be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites." Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you now come to me when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we are turning to you now. Come and help us fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead." And Jephthah answered, "Suppose you do take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head?" And the elders of Gilead replied, "The Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say." So Jephthah went out with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Then Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, "What do you have against me that you have attacked my country?" And the king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah's messengers, "When Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peaceably." And Jephthah sent messengers back to the Ammonite king, saying, "This is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. But when they came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and on to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, 'Give us permission to go through your country.' But the king of Edom would not listen. They sent also to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel stayed at Kadesh." Now Jephthah continues on with his political plea, trying to avoid war. And in the interest of time, we're going to move down to verse 28. Now the king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message that Jephthah sent him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah and Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of my door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns, and when Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who would come out to meet him? But his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels. She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said. and he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite tradition that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite. So like we usually do, what we're going to do next is we're actually going to watch a couple clips of some skeptics and how they usually try to frame this argument. And we're also going to see how they attempt to force their own interpretation into the text in an effort to force it to conform to their predetermined narrative or their predetermined conclusion before they even have evaluated a scrap of evidence. So here we go.
Good morning, and welcome back to Atheist Sunday School, a series in which I share with you some of my favorite horrible Bible stories. Today, we're going to learn about a mighty warrior named Jephthah. One day, the elders of his city came to him and begged him to lead an army against the invaders. They promised that if he won, he'd be anointed head of the entire city. So he accepted and headed out for war. In the midst of battle, though, Jephthah got scared, so he prayed to God. In his prayers, Jephthah promised that if God helped them win, Jephthah would sacrificially burn whatever creature first met him when he returned home as an offering to God. Super excited about this offering of painful death, God agreed and helped Jephthah win. But when Jephthah returned home, it wasn't an animal that met him, it was his daughter. Jephthah immediately regretted his promise, but it was too late now because it's not like God can say, never mind, dude. So Jephthah killed his daughter, but at least it wasn't a son.
Well, I think abortion is child sacrifice, and other people think abortion is health care.
God doesn't inherently have a problem with child sacrifice, as long as it's done for him. The story of Jephthah and his daughter makes this painfully obvious. If you're unaware of this story, it's a loving story where Jephthah leaves his family to go and fight for God against God's enemies. Jephthah makes a promise to God. He pinky swears with God. He's like, if you help me defeat them, then I will sacrifice the first thing that runs out of my house and greets me. And then God, fully knowing what is about to happen, pinky swears with Jephthah. And guess what is the first thing to run out of his house? His daughter. And then he has to kill her and burn her body. God willfully accepted a child sacrifice in order to please him. God does not have a problem with child sacrifice, as long as the child being sacrificed is being sacrificed specifically for him.
Now, I want you to notice how subtle, at least they think they're being very subtle, the argument that they frame attempts to be. It starts by initiating, both arguments actually start by initiating a fallacy called poisoning the well. Now, that's when somebody intentionally shares false and misleading information in an effort to psychologically prime their audience for what they're about to hear or for the claim that they're about to make. The goal is to taint the audience's perception so that anything that follows, anything they say next, already gets a pass free of scrutiny and questioning because it's accepted as valid, regardless of if the evidence backs it up or not. Now, the first claim that's made is that Jephthah was in the middle of a battle and he was really scared, probably of losing his life when he made this vow. The problem with that claim is that there's literally no textual evidence to back this claim up. It is a complete and utter fabrication. Absolutely nowhere in the text do we find Jephthah being in the middle of a battle? Do we find him being scared? Or do we find him being worried? So again, this claim is a complete lie. It's simply an assumption that's being made, that's being forced into the text so that it forces the text to conform to the view that the content creator wants it to. And I'm going to be honest, it's never a good sign when you have to start out lying to your audience in order to make your claim have any kind of credit. Now, the second claim that's made is that God got super excited about the vow that Jephthah made, and that God agreed to and accepted the terms of his vow. But once again, the problem with this claim is that it is a complete fabrication. Yet again, there is literally no textual evidence to support this claim. There is no mention in the text of God accepting the vow. There's no mention of him agreeing to the vow. There is no mention of him being pleased by the sacrifice or any other way you want to try to spin it. Once again, what we have is an assumption that's being made and being forced into the text by skeptics in order to force it to say what they want it to say. But I'm going to be honest. I like to call it for what it is. It is a bold-faced, unapologetic lie. It's a lie that's being intentionally told because the reality is if the truth ever got exposed, then the foundation to their claim would crumble and they'd have nothing left to build it on. Now, the third claim that both content creators make is that Jephthah had no way out, that he was forced to uphold his vow, and that God forced him to perform a human sacrifice even after he realized he had made a mistake. And surprise, surprise, here's our third lie. Nowhere in the text does it say that Jephthah was required to uphold his vow. Nowhere in the text does it say that he was forced to uphold his vow. Nowhere in the text does it even say God expected him to uphold the vow. But we're going to go even one step further. I'm actually going to provide you some evidence showing that Jephthah was in fact not required to uphold his vow. Because you don't need to read it for yourself, bro. Just trust what I'm telling you. Should never be a valid argument. But unfortunately, that routinely seems to be pretty much the only argument that we ever get from skeptics. So, on that note, to prove our point, if we go to Leviticus chapter 5, verses 4 to 6, we read, "If anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, any sort of rash oath that people swear, I don't know, like maybe killing something or killing someone, and it is hidden from him, or he doesn't realize the consequences that his vow could have, when he comes to know it and he realizes his guilt in any of these, when he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin that he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for that sin that he has committed a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him in his sin." Now, we could just end the video right there, if I'm being honest. We've already proved that the three main claims being leveled are complete fabrications. They literally have no evidence to support the claim. They're just assumptions that aren't based in any kind of factual evidence. But that would be too easy. What we've just pointed out is a clear solution to the problem that Jephthah had. But just in case this evidence isn't enough, we have more. See, I'm not going to stop at just leaving you with, well, here's a random law that we never really know if it was acted out on or upheld. I'm going to give you a clear-cut, documented example of this exact situation being played out with the opposite results. And I'm going to show you a portion of scripture where this law was used to free someone from death due to a rash vow. If we go to 1 Samuel, we read a very interesting story. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with an oath. So he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. And then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.'" Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me, what have you done?" So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die? He who has brought us this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men ransomed Jonathan, and he was not put to death. So here we clearly see within the framework of Israel's legal system, not only was there a way to redeem someone who had been dedicated to the Lord under a vow, but we actually get to see it in action. This isn't conjecture. This isn't a just trust me, bro moment that we've just gotten to experience from the content creators we watched. This is physical, concrete evidence that supports our claim. And that makes it extremely significant because it proves unequivocally that Jephthah did not have to sacrifice his daughter, which is odd because we were just told by two content creators that he couldn't get out of it and he was forced to uphold his vow, even though he didn't want to, when in reality, he could have redeemed her. The problem is he chose not to, and that raises another important question. Why? Why did he choose not to redeem his daughter when there was already a clear law in place that gave him the ability to do it? Now, don't worry, we're going to get into that a little bit later as we go through the rest of the story, but we'll also be providing additional evidence and more evidence to show that not only did Jephthah have a way out of his vow, but he was actually in direct violation of God's commands and God's laws by upholding his vow. But for now, my intention is just to showcase how disingenuous and intellectually dishonest these skeptics need to be in order to give their claim any kind of validity. If even a minute amount of scrutiny or questioning is added to the equation, then their claim gets completely dismantled. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to actually slow down. We're going to break down and we're going to closely inspect the passage that we just read. I'm going to do this because I don't want to just outright dismiss the claims that we just heard. I don't want to assume that just because the evidence is fabricated, that the claim is false. See, even in our modern day justice system, a criminal can still be guilty even if the prosecutor fabricates evidence against them. Just because the evidence isn't real doesn't mean that the crime never got committed in the first place. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give their claim a chance. We're going to see if they can begin to build anything even remotely resembling a solid foundation. But before we go any further in the Jephthah's story, we need to stop and really understand the world where Jephthah's story takes place. Because if we miss that, then we're going to miss the entire point, the entire passage. And honestly, I think that this is where a lot of people not only misread the passage, but they misread the entire book of Judges. Because when most people open up the Bible and they read about a person called Jephthah being called a judge of Israel, what they automatically picture is somebody heroic, somebody that they should look up to, almost like a clean-cut biblical role model. But that's not who Jephthah is, and it's not what the book of Judges portrays. The book of Judges is not a celebration of Israel's faithfulness. It's the complete opposite. The entire book is a warning about what happens when a nation loses its identity. And that's why Judges is one of the most darkest books in the entire biblical narrative, because it documents the unraveling of an entire civilization. And the deeper that you move into the book, the more chaotic things begin to get. At the beginning, the compromises seem kind of small. Israel fails to fully drive out the pagan nations and the pagan practices like they were commanded to. And at first, maybe that doesn't sound like all that big of a deal. But slowly, these little compromises start turning into bigger compromises. Foreign gods start to appear among the people. Pagan worship practices start blending in with Israelite worship. We see violence increase. We see sexual corruption spread. And over again, Israel starts to look less like the people of God and more like the pagan nations surrounding them. Until when we get to the end of the book of Judges, there's literally no distinguishable difference. And that is the real tragedy of the book of Judges. It's not just that Israel sins. It's that Israel slowly becomes indistinguishable from the nations that it was supposed to be different from. And the book intentionally shows the decline getting worse and worse and worse with each cycle. Israel rebels, then they suffer oppression, then they cry out for help. God raises up a judge, and their peace returns temporarily. And then the cycle starts all over again. Only each time it gets worse. And by the time we reach the story that we find in Judges chapter 11 of Jephthah, things are already starting to spiritually collapse. In fact, there's one important line that seems to get uttered over and over again within the book of Judges. We actually find it 4 separate times. We see it in Judges 17:6, in Judges 18:1, in Judges 19:1, and in Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Now that phrase is haunting because it means that objective truth and objective morality within the nation of Israel had completely collapsed. Everyone saw themselves as their own moral authority. There was no king to govern the land or uphold the law, and everyone had their own version of truth. They had their own version of morality, their own version of God, which I don't know about you, but honestly sounds eerily familiar to some of the common themes that we seem to see popping up in our modern culture. But here's why this matters so much for Jephthah's story in particular. The author of Judges isn't presenting us with a spiritually healthy environment where everyone understands God correctly. In fact, the book of Judges goes out of its way to highlight a nation that's been infected by compromise. And Jephthah himself reflects that brokenness. When we first meet him at the beginning of chapter 11, he's the son of a prostitute. He's rejected by his own brothers and driven away from his land. And eventually, he surrounds himself with what scripture calls worthless fellows or rebels. This is a man that's been shaped by rejection, instability, survival, and war. And eventually, Israel becomes so desperate enough that they actually ask him to lead their armies into battle. And this is where Jephthah says in Judges 11:7, Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble? Now, what's interesting is before the battle even begins, Jephthah actually does something very interesting that often gets overlooked. He actually tries diplomacy first. We read in verse 12, then Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with a question. What do you have against me that you have attacked my country? See, a lot of people skip over this part entirely, but Jephthah spends a large portion of the chapter, almost half of it, in fact, arguing historically and politically with the king of the Ammonites. He explains Israel's history, he explains why Israel didn't steal the land unjustly, and he tries to reason with the Ammonite king before war ever begins. Now, unfortunately, we see that his attempt at diplomacy fails, but it's something that we need to note nonetheless. The reason that we do need to note it is because it actually shows us that Jephthah isn't just some mindless barbarian who's charging in the violence without any thought. There's actually a little bit of complexity to him. But then right before the battle is where the atmosphere changes. That's where something shifts. Jephthah makes a vow, but the vow is a weird one because the vow itself seems off almost immediately, like there's something really wrong with it. So I want you to listen carefully to what he actually says. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Now pause there for a second. Think about it. Why is he even making this vow? That's a question I think a lot of people overlook. They don't even think about. Because according to the text, literally in the previous verse, it says the Spirit of the Lord had already come upon Jephthah. And that was before this vow was ever even made. We see this phrase uttered multiple times throughout the book of Judges, especially when it comes to referring to the story of Samson. And what the phrase actually seems to allude to is that when the Spirit of the Lord would come upon someone like Jephthah or like Samson, then the job that they were tasked with was taken care of by God. He gave them everything that they needed to accomplish the task that he required of them. And so what's interesting is that that detail isn't in this story by accident. It's extremely important and extremely relevant to the story. Jephthah already had a reason to trust that God was with him. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him. God had given him everything that he needed to accomplish the task that he was set forth to do. All he had to do was trust that God would take care of it. So why does he suddenly start bargaining with God? And why does he feel the need to negotiate? And this is where many scholars believe we actually start to see just how spiritually distorted Israel had become during the time of Judges. Because Jephthah's vow doesn't sound like biblical faith. It sounds like pagan manipulation. It sounds like if you do this for me, then I'll do that for you. And that's transactional religion. That's using God for your own benefit. And in the ancient world, this kind of bargaining was extremely common within pagan worship. People would offer their gods sacrifices in exchange for victory or fertility or protection or favor from their gods. Old Testament scholar Daniel Block explains it this way. Jephthah's vow reflects a misunderstanding of Yahweh that was more pagan than covenantal. That's an incredibly important insight because the issue may not be whether Jephthah just sacrificed his daughter or not. The issue begins much earlier than that, with the fact that Jephthah seems to think that God can be bargained with through extreme devotion. And honestly, many people still believe this today. We don't see it in our modern times as much through sacrifice, but we see it through desperation. God, if you get me out of this situation, I promise I'll change. Or God, if you answer this prayer, I will dedicate my life to you. Or God, just save this relationship and I'll be a better person, I promise. And listen, there's nothing wrong with crying out to God emotionally. There's nothing wrong with asking for his help or just speaking how you feel in a raw emotional moment. But there's a difference between trusting God and trying to use God. And that's because biblical faith is always based on God's character, but pagan religion is based on manipulation. That's the difference. One chooses to trust God with the outcome. The other needs to control the outcome. And the terrifying thing about compromise is that sometimes people can still use the language of faith while slowly adopting a completely distorted view of God underneath the surface. And that's exactly what makes Jephthah's story so unsettling. Because by this point in the story, within the book of Judges, Israel's spiritual confusion had become so severe and so decayed that one of its own leaders believed that this kind of vow, this kind of reckless negotiation, an attempt to use God for his own benefit, honored God. And then comes the moment that changes everything. He wins the battle. He gets exactly what he wants, and he returns home victorious. But then the text says, "Behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and dancing." And honestly, this is probably one of the most devastating portions of scripture within the entire Bible, because the text starts to slow it down here almost in a way to try to make it cinematic. You can feel the weight of the situation after all the violence, after all the war, after all the tension. The person waiting for him isn't a servant. It's not an animal. It's not a stranger. It's his one and only daughter. And the text actually even emphasizes that. She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. And suddenly the vow that Jephthah made, the reckless vow that he made, trying to use God for his own benefit, now feels horrifying. He tears his clothes in grief, and understandably so, because he's starting to realize the weight of what he's just done, and it all comes crashing down on him at once. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." But again, like we touched on earlier, there's something happening deeper beneath the surface of the story. Because instead of just recognizing that he had made a reckless and sinful vow, like the book of Leviticus tells us people can do sometimes, instead of just humbling himself before God, repenting of his sin, and acknowledging that he had made a mistake, Jephthah appears to double down. And I think this is where the story starts revealing just how spiritually dark the period of Judges had become. Israel had fallen so far into compromise and corruption that one of its own leaders actually believed that God would take pleasure in the fulfillment of a forbidden sacrifice more than he would find pleasure in a repentant and broken heart. And I want you to think about how tragic that actually is, because this is the same God, Yahweh, who had repeatedly condemned human sacrifice throughout the covenant law. It was the same God who had warned Israel time and time again not to imitate the nations around them. It was the same God who called the practice of child sacrifice detestable. And yet somehow Jephthah seems convinced that keeping his vow matters more than obeying God's commands. And that's what makes the story disturbing. Not just the possibility of the sacrifice itself, but the fact that Israel had become so corrupted and decayed that its very leader couldn't even distinguish the difference between worship to Yahweh and the detestable practices that he had warned them against. He told them in Leviticus 18:21, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch, for you must not profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord." In Leviticus 20:1-5. And the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death. The members of the community are to stone him. I myself will set my face against him, and I will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Moloch, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Moloch, and if they fail to put him to death, I myself will set my face against him and his family, and I will cut them off from the people together and all who follow him." Deuteronomy 12:31. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. Deuteronomy 18:10-11. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire. Anyone who does this is detestable to the Lord. Jeremiah 7:30-31. The people of Judah have done evil in my eyes, declares the Lord. They have built the high places of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. And sadly, this is the same exact mistake that Saul would make in the first book of Samuel, the mistake that ultimately led to the kingdom of Israel being ripped from his reign, because Saul convinced himself of the same thing, that outward religious action was more important than obedience to God. And that's why the prophet Samuel responds with one of the most powerful rebukes in all of Scripture. But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice." In other words, God wasn't after ritual. He could care less. He was after faithfulness. He was after trust, obedience, and a heart that actually wanted to know him. And I think that creates a haunting echo between Saul and Jephthah. It's a reminder of the danger of becoming so consumed with religious performance that we lose sight of God's actual character. Because the scary thing is, it's possible to do something in God's name while completely misunderstanding and misrepresenting God in the process. We see it every day in our modern culture. We see pastors, ministers, churches, ministries, all claiming the name of God while simultaneously spitting in his face with their actions. And I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but it's the truth. And frankly, I think that is the greatest warning hidden inside the book of Judges. Now, here's where the debate really begins. Did Jephthah actually sacrifice his daughter? Or was she dedicated to lifelong service? And I think before we rush to answers, we need to at least acknowledge something honestly, that there are serious and respected biblical scholars on both sides of this discussion that go back and forth on this debate. Now, again, like I said from the beginning of the episode, I'm not interested in dodging the difficult questions or trying to force an easy answer onto the text just to get out of a difficult situation. So I'll tell you personally, after studying the passage, my view is that I lean more towards Jephthah actually did sacrifice his daughter. And the reason for this is because I think that the sacrifice interpretation is probably the most natural reading of the text. It doesn't require us to force anything into the text. The phrase burnt offering overwhelmingly refers to sacrificial language that we find throughout the Old Testament. And that's why many scholars conclude that the text actually describes a human sacrifice. For example, scholar Barry G. Webb writes, the most natural interpretation is that Jephthah did indeed offer up his daughter as a human sacrifice. Scholar Susan Niditch similarly states, the plain sense of the text is that Jephthah fulfilled his vow by sacrificing his daughter. And scholar J. Alberto Sagan argues even more directly. There can be little doubt that a human sacrifice is intended. Even respected scholar Daniel Block, despite strongly condemning Jephthah's actions, ultimately concludes, the narrator intends us to understand that Jephthah actually offered up his daughter. Now, I think it is important to note, just like we said earlier, that none of these scholars are advocating or arguing that God approved of what happened. And I think we need to make that distinction because one of the biggest mistakes that critics often make when they read passages like this is that they collapse two completely separate ideas into each other. You actually heard it in the two clips that we played earlier. If something happened in the Bible, then the Bible must approve of it. But that's simply not how the biblical narrative works. And frankly, it's being intellectually dishonest. It's simply a way to try to control a narrative and force your own preconceived bias into the text. It's a way to make sure that you tell your audience what they want to hear while avoiding the evidence so that you can affirm their belief. Because the Bible regularly records really, really bad actions without endorsing them. We see murder, rape, idolatry, incest, corruption, violence, and pretty much anything you can imagine. And that's why the book of Judges repeatedly reminds us that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, because that phrase is the heartbeat of the entire narrative, because it shows us what happens when people stop allowing God's character to define truth and morality. And instead, they begin reshaping him according to their own desires, their own fears, their own assumptions, and the surrounding culture. And that's why, despite the story being really horrific and not really being a great story to read and to dwell on and to think about, it doesn't create the theological problem that many critics claim that it does. Now, at the same time, in the pursuit of honesty, even though I don't particularly hold to this view, there are other scholars who argue that the story is describing dedication rather than literal sacrifice. And one major reason for that is the repeated emphasis within the story on his daughter's virginity. The text repeatedly focuses on the fact that she's never going to marry or bear children, and some scholars believe that that would make far more sense if she were being devoted to permanent sanctuary service. Scholar Gleason Archer writes, it appears that Jephthah's daughter was dedicated to perpetual virginity rather than put to death. And scholar John Bright also defends this position, emphasizing that the narrative's focus on virginity strongly supports consecration language rather than execution. But I'll just say this as honest as I can. I feel that you need to do a lot of telling the text what it's allowed to say in order to reach that conclusion. But I also think that faithful Christians can agree or disagree on this particular narrative because ultimately the point of the story remains the same. The point of the story isn't about the sacrifice. The point of the story isn't about whether Jephthah sacrificed his daughter or whether he dedicated her to sanctuary service. The point of the story is about what happens when people abandon God and try to reshape him into their own image. And it shows us what happens when people lose sight of who God truly is. And once you understand that, the story stops sounding like, look at this amazing act of faith. And it starts feeling more like, oh my gosh, what the heck happened? Look how far things have fallen. Because even if Jephthah actually did sacrifice his daughter, then the tragedy of the story isn't that God desired it. The tragedy is that Israel had become so spiritually corrupted that one of its own leaders actually believed he desired it. And again, like I said earlier, sit back and let that sink in. Think about how heavy that is, that a man can know about God, he can fight God's battles, he can speak religious language, he can outwardly look like he's doing all the right spiritual things, but he can still completely misrepresent and misinterpret God's heart. That's scary. But that is the part of the story that makes everything come together because it forces us to confront the fact that religion and genuine understanding of God are not always the same thing. And eventually, if we're not careful, we start attributing things to God and to his character and to his moral law that says more about how broken we are in our humanity than they do about God's actual character. And that leaves us to face a tough question at the end. Not did this event actually happen or what actually happened, but how does a person or a nation become so spiritually distorted that they're actually able to believe that this was something God would want? That a man living among the people of God had become so influenced by the surrounding pagan nations that he could no longer see the difference between Yahweh and the other false gods that the nations around him worshipped. The deeper problem was that the people no longer knew the God that they claimed to worship. And once that happens, everything begins collapsing. Having said that, now that we've gotten a chance to actually go through the story ourselves, kind of see the story behind the story, and understand it a little bit, the last thing we're going to do is rewatch the 2 video clips that we played at the very beginning. We're going to refresh ourselves a little bit on the claims that were made, how they were presented, and see if they still make any kind of sense now that we actually have a good grasp on all the details of the story. And then when that's over, we're going to go through a very quick, very concise, factually based synopsis.
Good morning, and welcome back to Atheist Sunday School, a series in which I share with you some of my favorite horrible Bible stories. Today, we're going to learn about a mighty warrior named Jephthah. One day, the elders of his city came to him and begged him to lead an army against the invaders. They promised that if he won, he'd be anointed head of the entire city. So he accepted and headed out for war. In the midst of battle, though, Jephthah got scared, so he prayed to God. In his prayers, Jephthah promised that if God helped them win, Jephthah would sacrificially burn whatever creature first met him when he returned home as an offering to God. Super excited about this offering of painful death, God agreed and helped Jephthah win. But when Jephthah returned home, it wasn't an animal that met him, it was his daughter. Jephthah immediately regretted his promise, but it was too late now because it's not like God can say, never mind, dude. So Jephthah killed his daughter, but at least it wasn't a son.
Well, I think abortion is child sacrifice, and other people think abortion is health care.
God doesn't inherently have a problem with child sacrifice, as long as it's done for him. The story of Jephthah and his daughter makes this painfully obvious. If you're unaware of this story, it's a loving story where Jephthah leaves his family to go and fight for God against God's enemies. Jephthah makes a promise to God. He pinky swears with God. He's like, if you help me defeat them, then I will sacrifice the first thing that runs out of my house and greets me. And then God, fully knowing what is about to happen, pinky swears with Jephthah. And guess what is the first thing to run out of his house? His daughter. And then he has to kill her and burn her body. God willfully accepted a child sacrifice in order to please him. God does not have a problem with child sacrifice, as long as the child being sacrificed is being sacrificed specifically for him.
So again, our first claim is that Jephthah only made the vow because he was in the middle of the battle and was scared. This simply isn't true. It's a fabricated claim, or more plainly put, it's falsified and manufactured evidence that's simply meant to bolster the end claim of the content creator. There is no textual evidence to substantiate their claim, and if the content creator feels any differently, I would invite them to comment or respond. The second claim is that God got super excited about the offering because he loves pain and torture, and so he agreed to the terms and helped Jephthah win the battle so he would sacrifice his daughter to him. Again, this is a fabricated claim. There is not a scrap of textual evidence that supports this claim, and the purpose of the claim itself is simply introduced in an effort to prime the audience for the end claim, that God is immoral while silencing any objection. We see in Leviticus 18:21, Leviticus 20:1-5, Deuteronomy 12:31, Deuteronomy 18:10-12, Jeremiah 7:30-31, and multiple other passages where God expressly forbids human sacrifice and even calls it detestable. In 1 Samuel 15, we are told that obeying God's laws and commands takes precedence and is always more important than any kind of sacrifice. So again, if the content creator can show anywhere within the text where it expressly describes God being happy about the vow, accepting the vow, being pleased by the sacrifice, or otherwise satisfied, I would encourage them to comment or respond. Or if they'd like to explain how the words detestable and pleasurable can have interchangeable definitions, then I'm also willing to listen. And lastly, the third claim was that God trapped Jephthah in his vow. Jephthah was forced to follow through with his vow even when he realized the unintended consequences that his vow had. And this is once again a complete fabrication. Leviticus chapter 5, 4-6 proves that this vow could have been nullified with a sin offering or a ransom. And in 1 Samuel chapter 14, we see a clear example of a rash vow that sentenced someone to death being nullified using the laws laid out in Leviticus. There's also no textual evidence to support this claim. There's no mention of Jephthah repenting and attempting to get out of the vow or being forced to comply with the vow. There is, however, ample evidence that Jephthah could have nullified the vow, yet chose not to. And this is because he felt the outward appearance of sacrifice was more important than obedience to God's laws and commands. And this is clearly attested to by the repeating theme within the book of Judges, showing that there was no king in Israel and that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so with that, I want to take a second and say thank you for taking the time to join us through another difficult conversation. Look, I know that there's a lot of passages in the Bible that aren't very easy to deal with. There's a lot of passages that force us to slow down, to think about things, and sometimes figure out and sit in tension much longer than we'd like to. But my hope throughout this series has never been to just gloss over problematic Bible verses with shallow answers and pretend like they're not even a challenge. My hope is to encourage people to look deeper than the surface, to ask better questions, and to realize that many of the passages that people use to attack the Bible often carry a much larger story than what's being portrayed. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, or if it challenged you in any way, I would really appreciate it if you could take a second to just hit the like button, the little thumbs up icon, so that we can get this video out to more people. I would also ask you to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any future videos that we put out. And lastly, whether you agree, whether you disagree, or whether you're kind of still working through the passage, I would encourage you to leave a comment down below. Let us know if the video helped you navigate the text and the passage, or let us know if you're still trying to figure things out. I do my best to try to personally respond to each and every comment, because I feel that every comment is important and that everybody should have a voice in the conversation. And as we close, like we mentioned in a lot of the past videos, I would just ask you to think, if your claim requires you to ignore the textual evidence and then goes one step further and requires you to ignore the historical evidence, then it actually asks you to ignore the scholarly evidence. And lastly, it tells you that you have to ignore the cultural evidence. Then I would encourage you to just sit back and really ask yourself, how valid is my claim? And should people take it seriously? As always, thank you for watching, and thank you for being willing to engage the conversation. And I'll see you in the next episode.
We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead. It's not like anything you've seen. Yeah, you best believe